Shopping is hard.
I can never find anything in my size.
I don't even know my size.
I buy my clothes the same place I buy my groceries.
There's a better way. Make it easy with Stitch Fix. Just share your size, style, budget, and done. Your personal stylist sends pieces picked just for you.
That was easy.
Stitch Fix. Online personal styling for everyone. Free shipping and returns. No subscription required. Get started today at stitchfix.com.
Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
By the time he really started abusing me, I was already pregnant with our daughter. Her heart rate dropped from 138 to the 90s and her arm began to jerk. She was rushed back for a head CT. The CT tech said something like, "Holy crap," when her scans came up, because her scans indicated that she had multiple areas of brain damage. She would never walk, talk, or see if she survived. And the only other person that leaves is him.
Welcome to Critical Incidents Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Ashley, a law enforcement veteran with over a decade of experience. Each episode, I'll be interviewing people about their own critical incident, a moment in their lives that shaped who they are today. From life-threatening emergencies to personal struggles, we'll hear firsthand accounts of resilience, determination, and the power of the human spirit. Join me through some of the most critical incidents that have changed people's lives forever.
I am currently a forensic nurse examiner, and prior to that, and actually after even becoming a nurse, I was a 911 dispatcher for 10 years. I have a lot of experience talking with victims and just really trying to help them.
I tell you, just working in law enforcement, I got to meet a lot of the nurses, right? We'd obviously have to go in for blood draws for DUIs, but when there was sexual assault cases and we had to, take a perk kit up there or recover one, you can explain more about this. Are you specially trained versus like a regular nurse? Because I know that in the jurisdiction that I work, they had to have their name certified to the circuit court with whatever jurisdiction that is. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so here where I am, and I'm located in Arizona, a forensic nurse is a registered nurse, and I think it's pretty consistent throughout all the states. Don't quote me because I only know Arizona. But it's a registered nurse who receives specific training and education that we use to provide specialized care for victims of crime. For me, in my role as a forensic nurse examiner, I provide medical and forensic exams for patients who've been sexually assaulted or involved in a domestic violence or strangulation. So what that means is a lot of times we'll do a kit. So we collect evidence for law enforcement. It's kind of that bridge between law enforcement and the medical field when there is a need for evidence collection. And then also for pediatric patients, I do the same thing. There is a difference between adult patients and pediatrics. So on an adult patient, I can do an exam and collect evidence for up to 5 days after an assault occurs. And then on pediatric patients, I can only collect, depending on the type of contact that they've had and the age of the child, I can only collect from 24 to 72 hours usually. We like to get within that 24-hour range because on pediatric patients, the DNA evidence just doesn't last as long as it does on adult patients. So we go through all the training on that, right? We learn about forensic evidence collection. We learn about the time frame for forensic evidence. We also learn about specific anatomy. Even those pediatricians or providers who are in the ER, even those nurses, right, they're not specifically trained to recognize any injuries that we might recognize because we have that special training.
Okay, that makes more sense. It is something different than what I guess a regular registered nurse would be looking for. And one of the things that really stuck out with me when I started like interacting with forensic nurses was that I could call them on the phone and they can kind of give me a good rundown of like what they believe happened versus the story that I got from both sides generally that were involved. And I thought it was almost like their personal experience can elaborate because they've seen these injuries before, or the lack of injuries, I guess.
Yeah. A lot of times I'll get asked by law enforcement to like if the injuries I see matches the story that they're getting. And if the patient's old enough to talk, obviously I'm going to tell them like, this is what the patient told me. And I document it because court, you need documentation. But I also can say, let's say there's a strangulation case and the patient says, you know, so-and-so strangled me and left this mark. I can say, this is what the patient says, and it is consistent with what we would see in exams and stuff like that.
How often do you go to court?
So I actually not been to court yet. I know it's coming, but here in my county, and I've only been doing pediatric sane nursing for about 6 months, and I've been doing the adult exams for about 2 years. And we are always behind, you know, in the justice system. It's just always delayed and always behind. And it could be years out. I could get called for an exam that I did 2 to 5 years ago. It just kind of depends on how fast the justice system works in the case.
That is always an extremely frustrating part of these cases. And I know that, you know, the SVU on the police department side, it always seems from the outside looking in that it's taking forever. And those cases, from my experience, have been some of the hardest cases to prove and to have a Commonwealth attorney be presented with all of the evidence that you have and them to say, okay, let's go forward with it. I think it's the hardest thing, especially really when it relates to sexual assault cases, because there's so much intricate detail that goes into that, people's stories, your perk kit, and I mean, there's just so much that goes into it. So I am frustrated how long that takes.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. It's frustrating for sexual assault, and I would say for domestic violence a lot of times too. It's just, sometimes it's just really hard to prove, unfortunately.
Yeah, domestic violence was one of it was most dangerous, I think, that I've been on. And I think across the country, that's what most police officers are considered pretty dangerous. And from your perspective for domestic violence, when they come in, when a victim comes in from domestic violence, what is your procedure with that?
So it kind of depends on what they're coming in for. If they're only coming in to be medically cleared and collect certain evidence, or if it's a strangulation, obviously we're doing a totally different exam, because in strangulation cases, we can see injuries, you know, to days after, even months after, because of those brain injuries that they can get from not receiving oxygen for a period of time. So typically what happens is we sit down, I kind of go over what I'm going to do with the patient, and then I ask them all their medical background. And then as an adult forensic nurse, I will do a forensic interview basically, and I will ask them to take me through what brought them in and take me through the assault that occurred. And then I document everything they say, because again, this is going to go to the lab so they can determine what they need to test most, right? And then also it's going to go to law enforcement, and it could go to court one day. So I want it to be as accurate as I can. So a lot of times I quote exactly what they're saying to me. And then after that, I will let their interview kind of lead my exam. So I will do a head-to-toe assessment. I will document any injuries I see. I will take pictures if they're willing to take pictures, and just kind of go through that process with them. But I really focus on too is when a patient comes in, they are going through probably the most traumatic thing that they've ever experienced, right? And I want them to leave feeling like I helped in their healing journey and I didn't add more trauma to them. So I really let them kind of lead the exam too, because I think a lot of times in domestic violence and sexual assault, they had this happen to them and they had no choice. And I don't want to take away from their choices. So I will in the exam and I will say, if there's any part of the exam you don't feel comfortable with, we don't have to do it. Because as a sexual assault survivor myself, I would never want somebody to tell me what to do in that situation. I would want to have that choice, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And it's a good point that you bring up. From at least my perspective, right? I'll speak from my perspective, is we want to bring justice where we can. And that has to go with the respect of the victim. As much as we would want, like, hey, I would really want you to get this test, and this test at least documented and taken so that we can have this evidence for court. Having the comfortability of the victim, have to relive some of those moments that they just aren't comfortable with at that time. From everybody's perspective, it's difficult, I'm sure.
It is really hard. It's really hard on the patient. And I think too, by the time they've gotten to the point where I'm at, right, law enforcement's already come in and they've asked them to tell them their story probably a million times. And so I try to make it to where I'm listening to what they're saying and I ask the questions that I need to know for documentation, but I also don't, like I said, want to re-traumatize them, because they not only did they live through this horrific event, but then they have to relive it when they're talking to each step in the process, and they'll have to relive it probably for the rest of their lives in some way. It'll always be in the back of their mind.
I don't know how it is across the United States. I'd assume it's the same, as that if someone commits domestic violence, that the law enforcement has to go and arrest that person. They don't have a choice. It's not one of those charges where if you have probable cause, you're like, okay, well, maybe I will, maybe I won't. It's in Virginia, we have to. I assume that that's how it is across the country, along with protective orders. Is that what you're seeing out in Arizona?
I think it kind of depends on what county you're in, right? And it kind of depends on your attorney, your district attorney, and what I guess, knowing the law enforcement side, you kind of have to have these things in order to prove, quote unquote, prove that there is probable cause to arrest them, right? And a lot of times victims aren't ready to leave and they don't want to press charges. But I do see a lot of times here that they will press charges if they have evidence, if there was a phone call made by someone else or a statement made by someone else or something that they have that can lead to that arrest. They will arrest even if, so let's say, somebody doesn't want that to happen at that time.
Yeah, and the reason I bring it up is I'm curious, from your background, and I'm sorry that you had to go through this domestic violence situations, and you get to see it firsthand, now. The reason I bring it up is that it's one of those crimes that the courts in my jurisdiction look at as something that goes against the morality of the community. And so they don't leave the option, I say this broadly, they don't leave the option to have the victim press the charges. Is that the Commonwealth, in this case, does it for them. Now, you go to court, there has to be a victim to a crime, right? And so obviously if, couples make up, or if, there's fear involved, it's hard to, prosecute people on that end. But that's the reason I bring it up. And I'm curious what your take is on that type of enforcement. Do you think that law enforcement should do it, even though there's a victim at the time that's like, no, don't do it?
I think that as a law enforcement officer, you're kind of taking on that role of protecting the community, right? And I think that sometimes in domestic violence situations, the abuse victim is not ready to leave, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve that protection, if that makes sense. That's how I see it. I think I reported multiple times domestic violence when I was married before, and he was never arrested. And I kind of wish that I don't know what the reasoning was behind that. I mean, I was on the phone when he broke into my house. There were things that were there that could prove, but at the time I don't know what was going on, but he was not arrested. And then I was afraid to leave, like a lot of victims are, because as we know, it's the most dangerous time for a victim, right? Is when they decide to leave. And I was afraid for my children. I was afraid for my life, not so much my children's life, because I never thought he would be abusive with me. But knowing what I know now, doing all the research that I have done, when there's domestic violence in the home and there are children in the home, the children are that much higher of a risk to be abused themselves. And that means emotionally, that means physically, that means sexually even. And I think that sometimes victims aren't ready to protect themselves, but maybe they need somebody who is. Because when you are in a domestic violence situation, sometimes I feel like also you cannot see clearly, right? Because you have this person here who is telling you one thing and maybe you're believing them. And maybe when you hear those words every single day, it kind of starts to set on your heart. You know, it's just there. And that's just kind of how you start to think too. And it's unfortunate, but it happens.
Yeah, and that is some really great points. Yeah, it's hard from the outside looking in when we see it differently than the people that are in the relationship, and it's hard sometimes to sit back and not say, all right, it's time to go, you know, let's not be in this situation anymore. But it is really difficult for someone in that position to just turn their life upside down because of the thought of leaving this person is either terrifying or this person they truly do love and love all the good parts about that person and didn't think that this was going to happen, and maybe it's a one-time thing. There's so many things that could go through people's heads. You became a nurse because of what happened to you and your family. Do you want to get into that?
Sure. I think the question people ask me the most is why I decided to become a forensic nurse. So and the reason I reached out to share my story is because of how domestic violence and child abuse have greatly impacted my life. So I'll just share the story of why I became a nurse specifically to work with victims of crimes. And I'll start with, in 2015, an 11-week-old infant named Emmeline came into the emergency department for abnormal arm movements. She was triaged and assessed, and she was sleeping comfortably in her mom's arms. The emergency room provider diagnosed her with a febrile seizure, which is basically a seizure due to a high fever, and then went to get her discharge paperwork ready. At this time, her heart rate dropped from 138 to the 90s, and her arm began to jerk. She was rushed back for a head CT. The CT tech said something like, "Holy crap," when her scans came up, because her scans indicated that she had multiple areas of brain damage at different stages of healing. And then further testing would reveal she had a broken ankle, a cracked skull, a spinal hematoma the length of her spine, which is basically just means like a big blood clot in her spine, and retinal hemorrhaging. She was flown to the Children's Hospital, which is 2 hours away. She was intubated. She was in a coma for 9 days, and she had seizures for days. They were really hard to get under control. And the doctors told parents that she would never walk, talk, or see if she survived. She spent a total of 16 days in the hospital, and miraculously, she survived. So she was diagnosed with abusive head trauma, which is a leading cause of child abuse deaths in the United States. And basically what abusive head trauma is, it happens a lot when parents are frustrated and they violently shake the child, or there's a blunt impact, or it's like a combination of both. And Emmeline is my daughter. So basically I was that mom who was holding the baby. And I kind of tell that story that way because it kind of takes me a little bit away from the situation and makes it a little easier to share. I was a young mom then. I knew abusive head trauma existed. It's more commonly referred to as shaken baby syndrome. I'd been married for about 6.5 years. I was working night shift as a dispatcher for an ambulance company, and my then husband was taking care of my children. I only trusted certain people to take care of them because I didn't want my children to ever be abused. Honestly, that was my worst fear. So I thought I was protecting them until this incident happened. We've kind of already gone over a little bit, but my ex-husband was always really abusive towards me. I won't say always, right? Because like you said, domestic violence doesn't start as domestic violence. Oftentimes it starts where you fall in love with this person, and then slowly over time, they kind of show you who they really are as a person. And by the time I saw who he really was, and by the time he really started abusing me, I was already pregnant with our daughter. So I felt a little bit trapped. And I thought, as long as he wasn't hurting my children, it didn't matter if he hurt me. And that is not a healthy mindset. And I know that now, and it's not true. If a man can hurt the person he says he loves, he can definitely hurt children he says that he loves, right? We talked about how in domestic violence households, the child higher risk for abuse. And that turned out to be true in my case. Not only was he abusive towards me, but he almost killed my daughter. If the doctor had sent her home that day, she definitely would not have made it through the night. And then years later, actually just recently, we found out that he had also been sexually inappropriate with our older daughter. This stuff that I learned after all of this had happened, not only do I know this from the research that's been done, but I know this from my own life. So I guess that's why I'm so passionate about sharing education, because unfortunately, especially in infants, even in older kids, a lot of times abuse is missed, especially in abusive head trauma. We know evidence shows us that it takes about 3 to 4 visits to a healthcare provider before they're accurately diagnosed. And that's just not okay for me. Like, I had taken Emmeline into her primary care provider multiple times, and she had been diagnosed with acid reflux. And she had also had like a little red spot in her eye, which was a subconjunctive mark from being shaken. And the doctor had missed it. And I didn't have any medical training. You know, I was a dispatcher, but I didn't know medical things. I was also a young mom who was just really trying to survive. And for a long time, I felt really guilty because I was like, why didn't I notice all these signs and symptoms? How did I not know that this was happening, right? This provider who had been a provider for a very long time, probably 20, 30 years, maybe, I'm guessing, didn't recognize the signs and symptoms. So that's when I decided, like, I had to learn as much as I could about it. And I had to educate as many people as I could. I sat there in the hospital with Emma, just kind of praying that she would survive, and also praying that if she survived, her life would not be painful, which no mom should ever have to do, right? But the doctors came in and they told me, oh, she's blind. She'll never see. And she was looking right at me after she woke up. So I was like, how is this, like, you can't tell me she's blind when she's looking at me. And they're like, no, due to the areas of her brain that were damaged, she will never see. They had palliative care come in and talk to me when she was intubated, basically telling me she would never have a normal life and I should put her in a home. And if she even survived, right, the outlook was not very good. And the nurses were the only ones who told me, like, no, just have hope. We never know what's going to happen. Just have hope. And I think their empathy and the way they advocated for me and for my daughter really changed my life. And that's what led to me wanting to help other people. I remember sitting there thinking one day, like, if Emmeline makes it through this, one day I want to be able to provide hope to people who have no hope, because had they not been there, I don't know where I'd be. I had a lot to process and a lot to go through for my own healing journey, but then I also had to be there for my kids, because at the time I had 2 kids at home too, and Emmeline, and I had to tell them that their dad was not going to come home. And I had to be with Emmeline, and I had to be there to help her heal in any way I could, but I also had to be there for my other kids. And eventually when Emma got out of the hospital, and I knew that she was going to be okay, right? We're very, very, very lucky. She does not have complete dependency like a lot of kiddos do who have abusive head trauma. And so I got to go back to work as a 911 dispatcher for the highway patrol. And while I was working, I was a single mom of 4 kids, and I decided I was going to go to nursing school. So I worked sometimes 48 hours a week and got my degree, and just kept thinking, like, the more I know, the more I can help somebody, the more I can prevent this from happening, the more I can be an advocate for Emma, the more I can learn. And I really didn't know that I was going to go to be a nurse. I thought I want to be a peds PICU nurse. That was my goal, right? And then in nursing school, our professor assigned us an education assignment, and I chose to do mine on abusive head trauma because I had already been teaching. I think the year after Emma was hurt, I started teaching at the teenage pregnancy program about domestic violence and about abusive head trauma. And so I was like, that's it. I'm going to do it on abusive head trauma. I turned it in, and she reached out to me and she said, you need to reach out to the emergency department and share this education. And while I was in nursing school, before I even became a nurse, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to give it a go and see what happens. And so I did. And from there, the Peds PICU NP asked me to come and teach. So I did. And then come to find out, she was the nurse practitioner who was there, who had come down to see Emma after everything had happened from Peds. And she remembered Emma, and Emma inspired her to create a maltreatment screening tool that they now use at the local hospital. And a lot of hospitals have maltreatment screening tools, which is great. And I think all of them should, which is another reason that I share as much as I can, because I know that some of them don't. And had they had a maltreatment screening tool when Emma had first come in, there would have been a chance of her going home. So that just kind of grew my passion for educating more and more. And then I thought, you know what? Not only do nurses need this, not only do doctors need this, but first responders need this training too, because they might also see an abuse victim and they might see something that someone else might miss. And in a perfect world, there would be no child abuse. We wouldn't even be here having this conversation. Like, I can't do anything about what happened to Emma. I would give anything for her to have a normal life. I can't do anything about what happened to my daughter, Novalie, but I can educate as much as I can and maybe keep another kiddo from having to go through what they went.
Well, first, I just want to say how badass you are. I mean, the ability to have such a traumatic experience, happen to your daughter, and to use that to fuel you to go and help others is inspiring. I mean, you don't meet people like that every day. You don't talk to people like that every day. And people that have not just talked about it, but went and actually did it. So I applaud you for that. And I think that is humbling.
Thank you. I just thought I had to do something. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. And I had to do something with it, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah. No, it does. Most certainly does. Yeah. And so how is your daughter today?
Emmeline is a miracle. We take her to doctors a lot, and they look at her scans, and then they look at her, and they don't understand, because from what the scans say, she should not be able to walk. She should not be able to talk. She shouldn't be able to see, and she does all of those things. She loves Lion King. It's her favorite thing. She would watch it on repeat, but she does have some developmental delays. She doesn't read at the level she's supposed to, and she doesn't do math at the level that she's supposed to. She has to have a caregiver with her all the time, just for safety reasons. She does have cerebral palsy in her left leg, like her left leg is affected by it. So she wears a brace, and then she has to wear glasses because she is blind legally in her left eye from the scarring from the assault. And yeah, she is amazing. She also, a lot of times, kids with brain injuries have behavioral problems, and she doesn't. I look at her, and because I'm part of some other groups for abusive head trauma survivors and their parents, And I am reminded like how lucky we are, because a lot of kids aren't as lucky and they're completely dependent, wheelchair bound. They have to have someone take care of them all the time. They can't talk, all of those things. And so I am extra thankful and amazed by her kind of every day. She's probably one of the strongest people I know. And I'm just really glad I get to be her mom.
This happened in 2015. How did you remove yourself from this situation? I assume that the dad is no longer ever involved in their kids' lives.
Ultimately, they arrested him. I think I was sitting there and it just hit me. I knew I would never hurt my children. I knew my grandma, who was also helping take care of the children, would never hurt them. And the only other person that left was him. When I went in, eventually police came to interview us. Hey, I know that my family would never hurt her. And the only other person that leaves is him for his interview. And he kind of made some statements. I mean, I'm sure you know, the suspect not going to tell you what they did, but they might make statements that are lesser. So that's what he did. He said, well, maybe this happened. And eventually kind of confessed, but it was to a lesser action than what he actually did. And so that's when they arrested him and he was taken into custody. And at that moment, I decided he will never see my kids again. I will never see him again. And he called repeatedly and I had to get a restraining order. And I had to tell him I didn't ever want to talk to him again. And I filed for divorce pretty early on. And he got the criminal case. Like I said, the justice system is slow. So it took probably 2 to 3 years. It's kind of a blur before he finally accepted a plea deal. And the prosecutor told me, because in abusive head trauma, we don't have a witness, we will be lucky if we get like 2 to 4 years. And I don't know, for me, it was kind of a religious, not like religious, but spiritual, I guess, because I don't really believe in religion, but I definitely believe in a higher power. And the night before they offered him a plea deal for 2 to 4 years, somebody called the prosecutor and said he confessed to them. And so they didn't give him the plea deal. And the next time I went into court, it was shocking to me. He accepted a plea deal for 10 to 15 years and he got 13. He only has to serve 11, which means that he gets out next May, which is really unfortunate, right? Because this is the hard part too for me. When I see these victims and I see what they go through with court, or I hear stories, that person, my ex-husband, will only be in there for 11 years total because he only has to serve a certain portion of his sentence before he's eligible for release. But my daughter will have a life since, right? Her life is completely changed. And so are my other kids' lives. They also have a lifetime of unknown. And I will have a lifetime of unknowns and a lifetime of regret for loving the wrong person and recognizing that I deserved better and that my kids deserved better. Sometimes I always say this when I go to teach my pregnancy programs. Sometimes it's hard, especially when you grow up home where you don't have a dad. So for me, I didn't have a dad. I grew up being a mom. Like I said, I had abuse in the home my whole life. And I didn't want them to grow up without a dad. And I thought, I can survive this. He's not hurting them. But sometimes it's safer if there's one parent not involved in the kid's life. I say one parent because a woman can abuse a child or be the domestic abuser in a relationship as much as a man can. And sometimes it's just safer for the kids not to have that one parent. And that turned out to be the case. And a few years after my divorce was finalized, I decided to sever his rights and I went to court. I had to represent myself because, again, I was a single mom of 4 kids, so I didn't have a lot of money to hire anybody. But I knew I had to do everything in my power to make sure that he didn't get to see them again when he got out. And they severed his rights. and he will never have custody of my children. He will never get to see them again, even when he gets out.
Good.
Yeah.
What a strong story you have. This is,
Thank you. I know it's hard to hear, but I think it's really important.
as hard as it is to hear, I can't imagine going through it, and there had to have been so many times that you woke up and you're like, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, this is working this much and going to school and raising 4 kids and, just finding that will to continue on. Hearing someone's story and thinking about point A to point B, right? So from 2015 to now 2025, it's 10 years. And to us in our mind, when we think about it, it's like, oh, it's, 10 years it goes by, but we don't know your day-to-day life of, just the things that we all live through, different experiences, but what you have lived through and woken up every day and chosen your kids and yourself is truly admirable.
Thank you. I won't say it's easy. I don't ever want to give the idea that it was easy because, like you said, there were a lot of days where I was like, what am I doing? I'm missing this for my kids, or I'm missing that for my kids. Or I also struggled, like I said, with a lot of guilt and a lot of thinking like I didn't deserve happiness afterwards. And it took a lot of therapy and a lot of just kind of recognizing that I was a very broken person and I had not healed my trauma. When I met my ex-husband, I was 18 years old when we got married. And I didn't even know who I was. Like, I was still a kid. I was a kid having kids. And I grew up where abuse was normal. And I just kind of thought I didn't really matter. And so I had to find my own worth. And I think working as a dispatcher really helped me find my worth and helping people. And then going to school and realizing that I was smart, right? Because when I was in this domestic violence relationship, he would tell me things like, you're never going to be anything without me. He would tell me that my body was ruined because I had kids and that no one would ever love me. And all of these things that kind of became truth in my eyes because I heard them so much. And because I thought, if this person who says he loves me so much thinks all these things about me, then they must be true. And they just weren't. Like, it took me a long time to realize that I was so much more without him and I could do so much more without him. And I was a better parent without him. And that I did deserve to be happy. And that I did deserve to find someone who actually truly loved me and my kids. And that nothing he said was true. And I think it probably took me like 5 years before I finally believed that he had been lying to me.
Yeah. That's a difficult thing, is when the person that you love or are in love with tells you something, you tend to believe them, right? I think anybody would. If my wife told me something, I would believe her because she knows me, right? And I think the same thing. And I think that it's, just as important as parents, like our kids love us in a different way, but we tell them things about themselves. And if it's negative, they're going to believe it.
Yep, 100%. I totally agree. And I think my mom kind of told me some negative things about myself. So I had already had that in the back of my mind, and my abusers had from my childhood. And I think that I was just an easy target for him, unfortunately.
Yeah, that happens. I think that when people recognize weakness in other people, they do exploit that. And I'm sorry that happened to you. Well, hopefully you found yourself somebody else who's a good person, good father figure.
Yep. I've been married for 2 years now. We'll be 3 in November. I've been with him for about 6 years, and he adopted my kids about 2 years ago, or a year ago, almost 2 years ago. And I actually met him at work on a ride along. As a dispatcher, you have to go for ride alongs. When I moved, the Highway Patrol closed their center, and I ended up going to a different center while I was finishing my prerequisites. And they made you go on a ride along, and I met him, and we talked for the whole 12 hours that I was with him, and then asked if I had any roommates, and I said I have 4, and they eat all my food and they don't pay any rent. So, and that did not scare him away. And he is probably our biggest cheerleader, and he really pushed me to continue dreams. I'm currently going to school for my master's so that I can be an F&P in forensics. And yeah, he's really great. And I think I had to go through a lot of healing before I was ready for him, because it's hard when you've been in such toxic relationships to accept love from somebody who actually really loves you and wants to be there for you.
There's nothing better than to have a supportive partner. The person that you're with is going to be your biggest cheerleader for you and your family. And those are the people that really see your true potential and help you bring it out. And then I'm so glad that you got that.
Yeah, I am glad too. Also, your wife is amazing. So I only know her through her podcasts, but
she's a hoot. We have a good old time together. It's one of those relationships where we're just best friends. That's what we are. And we happen to be married to each other, which is great. And our kids are good kids.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it, is to marry your best friend and your biggest cheerleader. And that's the only way it works, I think.
Yeah. Well, I hope that you continue to spread your story. And I mean, it really is. I wish that there was a way that people could feel, the experiences that you went through, not to the bad part, but just to feel what it's like to overcome adversity, because it's hard. And, to walk in somebody else's shoes is different when you hear it. But if you could just, sit in the mud with someone that's going through something like that, it really does, mold us in our character as a person. And so I truly hope that you continue to tell your story and educate people on these, important topics. I can't think of how many times, we've taken our kids to the doctor or the ER, and I wonder if they had done the screening, So I'd be curious, if things like that get better processes, put into place. We're winning, right? You're winning at this. And so please continue to do this. This is a fantastic story and advocating for good things.
Thank you. That's my goal ultimately, is to educate as many people as I can. I'm starting here in my little town, and I just hope to break out to hospitals, law enforcement agencies, EMS, anybody who will have. I just want them to hear about the signs that are, so that they know.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Brittany, I really appreciate you coming and telling your story. I can't wait for this episode to come out so everyone can hear it. And as soon as we're getting off phone, I'm going to go talk with Heather about this, because I'm sure she's curious to hear how it went.
But thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for telling the story, and continue to do what you're doing, because it's an inspiration to a lot of people.
Thank you.